thank you for joining me for today's SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup, IEW edition, for November 18th, 2020. So good to be with you today, and as we plow through International Education Week today, we'll cover a lot, just a heads up, we'll cover a lot of the data from Open Doors, from actually the new SEVIS by the numbers report from September 2020, just released this week. More on that and some of the other ancillary IIE reports that help fill in the blanks for us on what the picture of international student enrollment is. We'll take a look in depth at those next week after we give ourselves a chance to digest all that information. But for now, what we do want to focus on today, like we do each week on the Roundup, are three important questions that we've been hearing from international educators during our 1 week of the year where we celebrate what we do in international education in a national and international way. So for those new to the Roundup, this is our opportunity to talk in depth about those three questions that we've been hearing. What we do on Mondays each week is we put out a newsletter called All the SMIE News Fit to Share, and that stands for Social Media and International Ed News, about 5 or 6 social media stories and anywhere from 20 to 30 international ed stories, and sometimes where those overlap. And so we put that out on Mondays, and then we go in depth to 3 of those themes on the Roundup each Wednesday. Both the Roundup and the newsletter are free to all, and you can find out details on subscribing to both of those at smieconsulting.org/subscribe. So want to give a shout out to those that are watching live. Obviously, it's great to have you here with us on Wednesday afternoons, depending on where you are. And to discuss and get your feedback on issues that are relevant to all of us in the field. And also for those that listen to us on podcasts, that make us a part of your regular listening as you work out, as you work, as you think about the day, as you meditate, whatever the case may be. We're glad we're a part of your weekly listening experiences. So thanks for making the Roundup a part of your regular journey each week. We're happy to be a part of your lives. So let's get right into the first question, and I'll drop the link to this week's IEW edition of the Midweek of the newsletter, All the SMIE News Fit to Share. I'm dropping that link into the comments section on the Facebook page, where you can find all the stories that we're going to be covering, and I'll also be posting the links to the key stories that kind of illuminate the topics we're discussing. And the first one up is, how has the pandemic changed international student recruitment? And it's for many schools that have been long doing armchair recruitment and not been traveling. This is nothing new to you. This is digital recruitment and virtual recruitment and working with partners overseas that are on the ground that can do the work for you. This is your way of international student recruitment. And so your lives have probably not been as dramatically affected as those that have been used to physical recruitment, travel overseas to fairs, schools, events for international student recruitment. So we're all aware of what has happened. Our lives have become basically Zoom meetings in one way or another over the last 8 months. And it's getting to the point now where many of us are finding ways to cope with the constant churn and burn in terms of our daily recruitment, where we could, instead of being overseas recruiting and having 20-hour days, filling up time with waiting in line at airports, waiting for flights to take off, waiting for hotels and sitting in traffic, on all of the various things, plus the fares that you have to do and visits you have to make. A lot of us who have done that life now have lives that are very tiring in a very different sort of way. You might end up doing a 20-hour day easily when you're on the road recruiting, including all the travel that you might need to do if you're going between countries or cities. But now you're up in the middle of the night doing virtual visits with schools and fairs at all hours of the day that force your schedule into very much a travel mentality. And that has been one of the things that I think is most significant for those that have not physically recruited before. But what has happened for those that have been forced to rely, based on budget and other circumstances, on armchair recruitment only, if you had a digital game before, it's now supercharged, isn't it? Because the types of opportunities, frankly, that have appeared for institutions to do visits virtually to schools, to have there be these free Education USA fairs that draw 20, 30,000 students a pop for different regions of the world. Those are opportunities you didn't have before that are now readily available to you, and that should be elevating your game in terms and elevating your reach, frankly, and getting you, ironically, in front of more students now than you had been able to do previously. And even I've heard this from those that have done recruitment travel for years, is they're seeing students from different parts of the world that they've never traveled to before, that they're actively engaging on in these virtual connections, however that's being done. They're having the time to really start those conversations and hopefully have them lead to for future applications and hopefully admitted and enrolled students. So there's definitely pluses that have come out of this, and certainly though our luggage is certainly regretting us not being able to travel with it and take it places all around the world and get it all beat up. But certainly they miss that you don't have that, you don't have the stamps in your passport, you don't have the cultural experiences you get when you travel internationally. Those aren't available right now, and it's hard to say when those opportunities will be readily available to us. One would think by next fall, if all the vaccines start getting out into the wider distribution, that might be a possibility, but I'm not too confident yet on fall 2021. Probably spring 2022 is when we can first see regular events happening on a global scale and that's assuming we don't have any other global pandemics that come up in the interim. But we're in a phase of the world where we have grown increasingly closer, even through our isolation and quarantining and all of the separation we have. Digitally, we've been able to grow closer with students, with school counselors, with Education USA advisors, with other partners we have abroad than we ever would have had before, because of just the time that we are able to spend and the breadth of coverage we can have in the world. The challenge right now is on converting those initial conversations into results. And that's what the application cycle is really all about. So we're looking at a time in recruitment of international students that is dramatically different than it had been at any time in our past. I know when I first entered the field in the early 90s, travel was it. That was where most students, or most institutions that were serious about international student recruitment, they were doing physical travel, tours, school visits, fairs. That there maybe some were starting to use agents back in the mid-90s, but not on a huge scale. And others were buying list names from TOEFL, from SAT, from ACT, and then using that to build their international database. CIS has a registry that they've done for decades as well. But it's a very different model now, that the opportunities for direct student recruitment this year are resigned to virtual. Unless we're talking about a domestic strategy. And we've talked about that here on the Roundup before, about the importance of having one leg of your international student recruitment strategy be domestically focused. Because you look at the number of students that are in the United States for high school, for community colleges, if you're looking at from a four-year school perspective, as well as ESL programs. Between those three areas, we're talking well over 150,000 international students that are in the United States already that are important and potential markets for you. There are schools in the U.S., large public schools, that have their first source market for international students being internal U.S. international students that are already enrolled in this country. So that low-hanging fruit, so to speak, is something that should be a part of your regular recruitment anyway. But even that, this year, is challenged because of institutions not allowing folks to travel for recruitment purposes, and quarantine restrictions and all of these wonderful things. Even domestically, this is a challenge. So Karen Fisher's article in the Chronicle really touches on a lot of the themes that we're talking about here related to digital strategies and how important those are in this day and age for international student recruitment. The quote that I do like most that describes this kind of change from the international ed side is from David D. Maria, Associate VP, Vice Provost for International Ed at University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He says, what worked for us in the past is not what's going to get it done for us tomorrow. And the fact of the matter is the timing of the pandemic at the the back end of the admissions funnel after admissions decisions had been made. Students are making decisions on where they're going to go, waiting for financial aid results. That timing couldn't have been worse, or could have been worse. It could have been right before classes began in the fall, when everything was shut down. But the challenges are that institutions were forced to come up with temporary plans for what would happen, and different versions or options that they had to present to international students. Do you offer deferments? Do you offer beginning online for the first semester and maybe even the first year, and then coming in the spring? Were there overseas options where students could start at one of your partner institutions overseas, or if you had a campus overseas somewhere? Was that an option? So there's a lot of different things that could have happened, but the nimble institutions were able to shift gears quickly and make the changes they needed into offering the various options we just discussed. Other institutions said, well, if you can't get here, you can't get here. We're not really set up to have a full online program for new international students without them being here, without being able to do an orientation. So there are big state schools in the Midwest and and throughout the country, frankly, that suffered with their international enrollments this fall because they really didn't have the right messaging and options in place for students that were wondering what to do, frankly, over the late spring, early summer for education, because their institutions weren't communicative enough about the realistic options for them. So how we communicate has to have changed in the last 8 months with our prospective students. The different ways we communicate, the different messages we use have all had to change, and that's something that I don't think is going to end anytime soon. There's going to be a continued period of uncertainty, even for students that might have been looking to come in the spring, or students that maybe you had deferred. That group there, and we'll talk about that more next week, about the size of that group of students that have deferred their admission for a semester, for a year. Keeping those students engaged is mission critical at this point, because if you've had a student who's indicated they want to defer, what are you doing? How much are you communicating? What are you communicating to that audience between now or when they first decided to defer and their eventual enrollment? How are they being cared for, frankly, and having their concerns listened to? That's an absolute rock solid piece of recruiting that cannot stop right when you've issued a deferment and you figure, okay, in a year's time we'll see you when you come onto campus. You have to keep engaged with those students because, as I've always said, these students have options. They have options beyond just your institution, beyond just the United States. They're looking and probably have already applied to other countries as well. They need backups. If the U.S. was their first choice, they may have 2 or 3 other countries that they're looking at. If major English language destination countries. So how much are you taking that into consideration with your messaging to deferred students, or particularly now this coming cycle? You have students that have seen what's happened on campus in the U.S. in the fall, see how the wider United States has not particularly adjusted well with the pandemic. How are we dealing with that in our messaging? They're seeing these negative images. That we have the one bright spot that we've talked about and we'll continue to talk about over the coming weeks and months, including today, about what the Biden victory means for international students in terms of re-energizing some hope and interest in the U.S. as a destination. We'll talk about that shortly, but what we really need to look at is the context of the global context that we're now operating in, and how our messaging must change to adapt to these markets, and the tools we use to get that message out. So as we just mentioned, the victory for Joe Biden in the presidential elections a couple weeks ago has really changed the dynamic, and certainly the one common theme that we've heard in a lot of the news stories, we'll talk about a couple of them here, is one of relief for certainly current students already in the U.S. There's a definite, tangible sense of relief that they have for their futures here in the U.S. and what they have to worry about and not worry about. So that's one piece of the puzzle. But when we look at future international students, the ones that we're currently recruiting, or maybe in the next year or two are recruiting, are they now starting to believe again in the U.S.? And there's a couple of articles, one by Karen Fisher here that shares her correspondence with international students that has them elated even about the prospects of being an international student in the U.S. as under a Biden administration. The challenge, as Karen rightly points out in her article, and we've talked about here, is just because the occupant of the White House has changed or will change in January, doesn't mean all of a sudden all the bad things that have happened over the last 4 years will go away. There's still certainly challenges out there where reaffirmations for the welcoming messages that we always have preached from our campus levels, we'll see that from a national level to overseas audiences. That's going to be an important piece of the puzzle. But we look at some of the things that will probably be reversed in the early days of the Biden administration, the initial travel bans, that's the third version that's the actual law now that apply with certain destination or certain source countries in the Muslim world and other places. We look at the protections for DACA students. We'll look at perhaps strengthening of H-1B and other and OPT as well. We see things like a proposal from Biden or in his campaign, he made the comments that all PhD international students, when they graduate, should get a green card stapled to their diploma. And that's a plan we've heard from both sides of the aisle, actually, but that's something that may see the light of day in the coming administration. So we'll talk about that certainly as more concrete plans in that develop. But one of the most encouraging reasons for optimism, I think, for how international students, prospective international students, will view the United States in the coming weeks and months, and hopefully the next 4 years, will be the story of the Vice President Kamala Harris and her parents, both of whom were international students. Her dad's from Jamaica, her mom's from India, and how they met and fell in love and lived the international student dream and became successes here in the United States. That dream they had when they came to the United States, and back when her mom came, it was perhaps not a very common thing for Indian women to come to the United States for study, as it has been more recently. But she certainly was a trailblazer, and her dad, certainly coming from Jamaica, both coming from former British colonies and having that history and that background, but coming to the United States for their education, and that their success here in the U.S. certainly speaks volumes about what the opportunities are. And that will be a beacon of hope, I think, for future international students when they see what could happen as something out there. Just as Barack Obama's father was from Kenya when he met and was in the U.S. when he met Barack Obama's mom. That certainly has always been. Certainly sparked a lot of international student interest because of that history. So holding up the Vice President, her parents, as an experience being the first African American and Indian American Vice President and female Vice President of the United States, that will spark hopes and dreams of students around the world. and that's encouraging. So certainly will international students believe again in the United States? There's every reason to believe that will be the case, and certainly there's more positive energy certainly coming into the Biden administration when it comes to international education than the dark glooming clouds that were looming when President Trump was elected and leading up to his infamous America First inauguration speech. So we'll see what happens. Certainly the optimism, as we've talked about, will be back in the eyes certainly of international educators in the U.S. and hopefully prospective students overseas that will again look at the U.S. as a welcoming destination for them. Now, our final question of the day is, when will most embassies and consulates reopen? And this is one that is more than anything else, I think, related to the numbers that we saw this week for international ed with the reductions in overall number of international students and new international students. We'll get to those numbers again next week more in depth. But when you think about the mechanisms of how a student, once they're admitted, getting their I-20, going for a visa appointment, hopefully getting approved, entering the United States, getting through immigration, getting their passport stamped for their visa F1DS, hopefully. And that process has been completely upended this year. Starting in March, most of embassies and consulates around the world closed down. And based on local conditions and permissions from host governments, only then, sometime in the summer or even through today, were they able to reopen. And for this, I do want to give a huge shout out to Jason Hall, a good friend of mine from now works with Brighter Ed in the U.S. And has just an incredible background. He's worked with a number of pathway providers as well as working on the campus side at different institutions, including Oregon State. But he has, as part of his projects now with Brighter Ed, he has compiled a U.S. embassy and consulate student exchange visitor wait times master sheet, and he updates this weekly. Posting the link to that in the comments section on the Facebook page now. But this list, it's all taken from publicly available information. The State Department has a site for visa wait times that you can scroll down, pick your country, pick your city, and then you can find out how long the wait time is to get a student visa appointment. And he's cataloged this over the last few weeks and months, and with regular, weekly updates on what that looks like. There were some, the current version of it that's out this week shows that 70% of all U.S. embassies and consulates around the world are either closed, list 999 days for a visa appointment, or are no longer listed. And that includes, I think, also emergency appointments only. So from this list, we see each week there's major changes this week, and he has a list of bad results. Where if like Berlin went from 1 day for an appointment to 11 days. Perth, Australia went from 1 day to emergency appointments only. Amman, Jordan went from 8 days to emergency only. So it's gone through all of this. Some are reopening. Guadalajara went from closed to have a 1 day appointment time, wait time. Abu Dhabi went from closed to a 30-day wait time. So there's good and bad in this, but one of the stark reminders here is how dependent, not just on the admissions offers that institutions make students are, it's on the open ability to access our U.S. consulates and embassies for appointments. And this list that shows 70% still closed or showing 999 days to wait for a visa appointment, basically, in effect, that means they're closed. But you look at the list here, and you see, particularly in China, you see all of these are the ones that are open in China. You see they are either closed, temporarily closed, like Chengdu is closed in China. Kolkata is closed in India. You have You have others, Hyderabad, which in India, if that's closed, temporarily closed, that's the where more Indian students go for their visa appointments in from Hyderabad consulate than anywhere else. You look in China, Wuhan is not listed, um, shows no results. Shenyang is temporarily closed. New Delhi is temporarily closed. So you have major consulates and embassies that are just unavailable for students to even apply for their student visas. So they can't get in even if they want to. Guangzhou in China has emergency appointments only. That's, I think, other than that, I think Shanghai is also in this category. There may be something else. I'll just double check on those as we go through. But the list is very certainly important for us to understand that the greater majority of embassies and consulates still aren't open for students to go apply for visas. So unless they're already in the U.S. or already have a valid visa, they're not going to come in January either. So until this gets rectified, and the important thing, I saw a post on ISSS United Facebook group yesterday or the other day that asked if are there any tricks to getting embassies to open and consulates to reopen to give visa appointments? And frankly, there are no tricks. If the host government does not allow consulate officials back in the country to then resume their duties, that's not happening. And it's only happened in very limited numbers in China, where, again, still majority of the embassies and consulates there are closed. In India, the majority are closed or temporarily closed. So you still have these real substantial roadblocks to students being able to come in January. So, and we can have all the optimism we want that things are going to change and we'll be back to normal soon. But when you look at what's happening, we'll take the example of China. Obviously, that's the number one market for the U.S. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. There are very few schools that don't have Chinese students as their number one source of international students. In the same period, look at two different periods. April to September, so the key visa awarding months for students that are looking to come for the fall academic year. In fiscal year 2019, 2019, so that would include the period from April to September. That in 2019, 90,000 student visas were issued to Chinese students in 2019. In that same period, and again, April to September, the key visa periods for students entering the fall, this year, that number was only 808. So basically a 99% decline from our top market and international students coming to the United States this fall for student visas issued. So that is, and we'll get to the numbers this next week in the Roundup in terms of the overall picture, but a 99% decline from your top source country, and it will explain a lot about why your numbers are down the way they are this year. You also look at the number two market to the United States, India. In the fiscal year 20, there were 64% less student visas issued in fiscal year 20 that ended in September. So fiscal year for the government goes October 1st to September 30th. So for fiscal year 20, so October 1st, 2019 to September 30th, 2020, student visas were down 64% in India. A lot of that's due to the pandemic in this fall, but there are certainly other factors there as well. But India, certainly once all consulates and embassies are back open and the pandemic is under control and host countries allow our embassies and consulates to reopen and start doing business as usual, will it still be usual? That's to be determined. But certainly when you have 99% drop in your primary market, China, India, your second most popular market, 64% down in student visas issued. That explains why we have student drops overall and with new students this fall. So these are the numbers that we're dealing with this year, and certainly it's hopefully a one-off year, and certainly comes at a time that hopefully we can wrap a bow on this after, with the Trump administration being finished, Biden coming on, pandemic being settled. 2021 will be a very different year. We'll keep our fingers crossed for that. Certainly, we'll keep you posted on changes as they affect you in your work. But certainly, we welcome your comments on these and look forward to further discussions down the road. So until next time, have a wonderful week and happy IEW. Take care.